Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We're live with another one here. I guess we're not live. We're here with another one um, that will be posted to YouTube at some later time. But
Taped
we're here,
live.
yeah, taped live. We're here again with our good friend Michael Chittister, who is, to for my money, one of the most important people in the Kunst Des Fechtens tradition.
Oh,
I really do mean that. We just got to spend uh, some time together in North Carolina with Christian Trosclair and Jess Finley, and man, was it a good time! And we talked about a bunch of this stuff. And actually, you and Christian both gave really two really interesting lectures that ended up going really well together. Uh, but I think you had
purely
mentioned
by
that,
chance.
yeah. uh,
I didn't actually even know Christian was going to be there till like 3 days before we left. So we did not plan to talk about the same topic on two different lectures, but it went okay.
yeah.
There's a lot to
Um,
cover when it comes to Lichtenauer.
Right, and you have been giving a lecture, like you have like a handful of lectures that you've been cycling through and recycling um over the years. And two of them are basically KDF centered. One is sort of the state of KDF, or a state of Liechtenauer's teachings in HEMA, sort of like what it is that he's teaching and how do we know, or how do we figure it out. Uh, and
Hmm.
that's you haven't given that one in a while, I think. And then the more common one is the history of the Kunst des Fechtens tradition of Johannes Liechtenauer. But then
Yeah.
you have a third one now. So tell us about
Well, I
that.
don't know. So yeah, back in like 2012, I was asked to give a lecture on the an overview of the German fencing treatise entire tradition for an event in Massachusetts, the Historical Swordsmanship Symposium at Amherst, which was the first time I'd ever like lectured on this stuff in public. And I was giving versions of that for, I don't know, ever since. But this was the first time I tried to strip it down to bare bones and start over again and reconceptualize, because the way I approach the topic has changed a lot in 15 years or 13 years or whatever the time period I just said was. And the lecture had not changed nearly as much, because it's hard to back new understandings into a thing you already have the flow figured out on, and the sequence of ideas.
Mhm.
So I would update it with better pictures and, drop in a new slide here and there, but it was substantially the same, or like affix a different conclusion onto the end. But this time, I don't know, even since the last time we did our first part of this video series, I think I've had a lot of new ideas come up. Like this spring, I authored a brand new translation of the Zettel, which was the first time I tried to make it rhyme.
Mhm.
Not the first rhyming translation anyone has done, but in my opinion, the best one. So, right. And that's a joke, but it's also not a joke, because I don't know, like I really tried to do one that didn't sacrifice fidelity to the text in order to make it rhyme, but
Mhm.
also doing some interesting things with translation that you can only do if you're willing to rephrase a little bit and move ideas around. So I think it stands up as a translation, even if it didn't rhyme. But also it rhymed, which is fun, and
Mm.
forced me to work a lot harder on it than I would have if all I wanted to do was express the ideas.
I also think it's relevant that like you've spent so much more time with the ideas themselves, so it's easier to make something coherent, right? If you're like this project, if you just sort of went in with a blank slate, you didn't understand the material, and you're just going line by line, let me make this rhyme, that's gonna come
You
across one
produce
way.
something very different,
Yeah.
and yeah, this was very much a place based. Like I still update it periodically, because I'm constantly chatting with people like you and Jess Finley, and others who are giving me ideas I've never had before, and then I look at the text and I'm like, well, I could tweak this here, and I could build this in. There are words that I reached a completely different understanding of this summer, even. Like
Mm.
the big one that I would pull out is Absetzen, which is a word we all understand, right? It means setting aside, because clearly what you do is your opponent attacks and you push it out of the way. But actually, what if I told you that there's two different groups of meanings of Absetzen in Grimm's dictionary, and the second one has been completely ignored in HEMA because it's only in the revised Grimm that no one actually looks at for reasons that aren't important to get into. But it's on the same website now as the main Grimm, and what it says is definition 2 is to entice or lure something out of position. And when you look at the play and a bunch of other things along those lines, like to remove a politician from office or to poach an employee from a different employer, like a lot of these kinds of ideas, but it's very much about temptation and not about pushing something out of the way. And when you look at the actual plays in the glosses that relate to Absetzen, they all start the same way, which is you stand in a guard and you offer an opening or an exposure to your opponent. And when they take that opening, then you counter.
Mm.
So the idea that's being put forward is not just the physical deflection, but the idea of tempting your opponent with an opportunity to attack you, and then having them take the bait.
Mm.
So Absetzen is not just to set aside their attack, but to lure them into attacking in the first place. And
Right.
that is 100% supported in the text. And then we look at the revised dictionary, and it's right there on the page. That is part of the meaning of the word. And it's not part of our teachings in modern HEMA about the word. Or if it is, we think we're adding something into the teaching when it's secretly been lurking there all along in the teaching itself.
Yeah.
So, like, there's a lot of things like that. Like, there's so much more to learn because we have better resources now.
Mm.
And to what you said a minute ago, I was talking to, I think, Steve Cheney recently about just the fact that we have so many better translations today. And like we look at it and the text isn't even hard to translate. And it's not just because we now have digital dictionaries and we don't have to like pull a dictionary off the shelf and find words. We can just do keyword searches and, you know, have wildcards and all kinds of fun stuff like that. But also, people have just been marinating in this now for 20, 30 years, some of us.
Right.
I'm up coming up in my 25th year now in HEMA. And like we just can understand the text more from through familiarity than we could like the groundbreaking translations of 20 years ago that someone spent years on. Now you can kind of hack together in a few weeks and do something just as good because we have that deep sort of internal understanding of just what the text is and how it's built and why it is the way that it is, and then we can go to the language, and it's much not nearly as steep a hill to climb to
Hmm.
engage with the actual words from that perspective. Does that make sense?
It totally does. Something else worth mentioning while you kind of brought it up inadvertently was when you were initially asked to put this project together. They it was very familiar. This is a very familiar idea to me. Like, I need a lecture on like the German fencing teachings,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like that's hilarious, right? Like that's a way of framing. That's a way of framing it that we generally don't do anymore. There's certainly some kind of coherence in terms of like the way that a lot of people in a very wide geographic space regarded fencing, and a lot of terms that were used across a host of these, that was part of Christian's discussion, right? Was that, a lot of these things existed already. And part of what we're going to get into today is that like there's like this, at least in our Kunst des Fechtens, but then there's also some Kunst des Fechtens that predate it, that use some of the shared terminology, if not the same framework. And then there's later stuff, right, that is also borrowing or certainly exposed to or informed by the stuff that we talked about in the last discussion.
Sure,
But
and
but have gone their own direction.
and there's lots of layers you can look at this at, right? At a certain level of granularity, you can say it's all just German fencing. They use funny words. you can make Hans and Franz jokes, and you can just like assume it's all the same, right? They
Right.
like smashing each other with swords. And you can drill down a little further and say, well, there's this guard called Iron Gate that exists in a lot of different sources. 133 mentions Long Point, and so does Lichtenauer, and so does Fiore, and like clearly, there's this underlying sort of substrate of fencing ideas that transcends tradition.
Hmm.
Or if you're of a certain ideological perspective, you can say clearly this is all the same tradition and we are just subdividing it unnecessarily. And you can go the pan-European route and say everybody was sharing the same ideas about fencing, which is a lie, but people
Which
believe it.
is right. Well, it's certainly a lie, but also like there's lots of I mean, you could build a case. It wouldn't be the most robust case in the world, but you could build a case, right? Like, we do have Iron Gate, we do have Long Point that
Sure.
basically exist and everything in the Holy Roman Empire all the way down to, Italy, etc. Um,
And there's a couple others. There's a couple different positions that are all called something like crown. There's a few different ones that have to do with horns that are kind of all sort of up here in front of you in different
right,
ways. Yeah, like you can make a vague sort of blob of maybe these ideas, create a framework. Not enough that you could describe fencing out of it, but clearly there's cross pollination. People were traveling, people were meeting each other, they were fighting each other,
yeah,
including in public tournaments. And in that context, they were probably also sharing ideas about fencing at the
right,
tournament, just like we do. So there's
right,
an extent to which this stuff was not very siloed, except I think when certain masters talk about how they thought things should be kept secret, we kind of have to take them at their word. And
right,
maybe their students didn't keep the secret, but certainly for a while there was probably secrets. Like Lichtenauer and Fiore both sort of, or not Lichtenauer so much as the Glosses and Fiore sort of have that idea that part of the way you win fights is by keeping what your training secrets. Talhofer mentions that too. Don't let your opponents know what you're practicing.
right.
So there's an extent to which this was not just information wants to be free. We're just going to share ideas around, but also ideas clearly spread around over time.
Right. Um, yeah,
And so
thinking about
that's a level, but I mean, you can. But when you drill down further, eventually you have to start acknowledging that there are differences that are not really compatible. And every master had his ideas that set him apart and that other guys were disagreeing with. It's not like this was one big happy family where everybody was on the same page. And
mhm,
so I'm a Lichtenauer guy at heart, as much as I like dipping my toe in other areas of HEMA. And like, there's all kinds of cool books out there. There's all kinds of cool stories out there, but it always kind of comes back to Lichtenauer for me, or at least it has for 25 years.
mhm,
The Zettel is where it's at for me. And I think that the way people relate to that, even within that context, the way they're relating to the Zettel and using it is not the same. And they are producing versions that they will all call Lichtenauer's fencing that are not the same as each other
right,
and going off in different directions. And sometimes doing things that probably are unrelated to Lichtenauer, but they're happy to roll it in there. Like there's a little treatise that sometimes is attributed to Ringek that talks about fencing from the Streichen, from the
mhm,
sweeps, and it's like 14-ish plays. And the introduction is just like, yeah, so this is not actually from the Zettel, but I promise you that if you do this stuff, you will see ideas from the Zettel emerge from it. So it's all cool. And
mhm,
like some people played fast and loose with the relationships there because they knew they were hooked into this tradition and they liked that, but they
mhm.
also had ideas that they wanted to teach, whether or not Lichtenauer taught them. You know what I mean?
Right, right. So let's recap what we did last time. So this is actually our second attempt at recording this because of the audio quality. Hopefully this time the audio quality is a little bit better. How does it sound on your end? Sound
You
okay?
sound fine. Does
Okay.
my mic sound like it's working?
It sounds like it's working. I would say just in general because I think it's connected to you somewhere on your lapel, so to speak. Just be a little bit careful how when you're doing whatever it is
All
that
right,
you're
I'll try
doing
to
in the
limit
kitchen.
shrugging, I guess.
There you there you go.
Ugh,
Um,
gotta
but
check
otherwise,
her
when
posture.
when it's not going boom, 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 then it sounds great. Um, you don't have to. You don't have to like.
All right, good.
Okay, so I've got Clooney pulled up. Last time we talked about this sort of the earliest known source for Liechtenauer's art, which is 3227A, and that sort of
Yeah.
sets this thing into
Let me give
motion.
you like a 2 minute spiel on Lichtenauer and the core gloss traditions.
That's
All
right.
right. So in sometime in probably the late 14th century, some might say the early 15th century, right? So late 1400s, early 1500s. We have this dude named Lichtenauer who wrote this teaching poem called the Zettel, which is a funny word. It's not important what it means. It's like a short list of notes or a thing you memorize, and it is written, he says, or the people say, in obscure and cryptic words, with the idea being that you can use this to teach, and nobody who hears it will have any idea what it means unless you have taught them what it meant, or Lichtenauer has, right? So it's about 360 or 40 or something lines long. It covers fencing with two-handed sword, unarmored, and it also covers dueling in armor, on horseback, and on foot. And those are sort of the two halves of the Zettel. But other Germans after Lichtenauer, and we assume they were his students or related to him, although I know some scholars like Maciek Talaga would want to have an argument about that these days, and they make some good points. So it's possible that there's more complicated stuff happening in this tradition than we know about. But for now, we'll say students of Lichtenauer took that gloss, and then when they were teaching their students, they started writing down the interpretation, or they took the Zettel, and started writing down their interpretations of the poem in what we call glosses. And this is a tradition that goes back a few hundred years, where you take a text and you express your ideas about it by direct quotes and then explanations, going line by line. And that's how the early Lichtenauer texts that are wordy, that have lots of text, were structured. One of them is 3227A, which is the manuscript designation of the book that has the only known copy of it. And that one's great and interesting, and frequently at odds with the other main sort of substantial gloss,
Or at least
which
at least
exists.
superficially at odds,
Yeah,
I would
yeah. So,
argue.
well, sometimes they're clearly contradictory. Whether they contradict in important ways or not is a whole conversation. I don't think they do. I think you can understand that they're expressing the same ideas with different words for the most part, with maybe some small tweaks in terms of, I think this cut works better this way,
Mhm.
like everybody has. But the other side of the house then is the what we call the RDL gloss, which stands for Ringek, Danzig, and Lev, which are three very, very similar versions of a gloss of the entire Zettel, which are potentially all written by the same person at different points in time. If that's not the case, then there was one gloss that was written that we don't have, and these are different variations of it that different people created. One of those things, two things, is almost certainly true. It's fairly impossible that three people working separately could have produced these texts that are so similar. It
Right.
would be some kind of miracle, divine intervention, if that happened. So we treat them as a single text, even though occasionally they too disagree with each other on small technical issues, and maybe occasionally on like a tactical question.
Mhm.
But we can look at this and we can see a relatively harmonious um, perspective on what Lichtenauer was teaching. If we want to, make them all disagree, that option is also there. And then there's also a few sources like Paulus Cal, who again we think was part of this core lineage, and even the Clooney Fecht book here, which go through the Zettel, or at least parts of it, and give us illustrations of the verses without actually giving us any explanation of the verse.
Mhm.
So we have, in addition to these texts that explain what Lichtenauer was teaching, we have books like the one on screen here that go through and give us a picture of virtually every play that Lichtenauer was teaching.
Right. Well, and specifically, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the plays as they're described in this gloss tradition.
Yeah. So
Because
these
because
pictures.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, um, there there are other ways of interpreting this. So, like, even in 3227A and the RDL tradition, they're not always saying the same thing when we get to the line by line in the Zettel.
Yes, that's
Um,
true.
And so, like, when we say that when we're talking about the Clooney as being a part of this core gloss tradition, it we know that that's true because the images, so far as we can tell, and we have a lot of reason to believe this, that the sort of freeze frame that we're getting from the images of the manuscript are, like, reflective of the plays as and the order as they're presented in this gloss tradition,
Yeah.
right?
So there's two pieces that we can say make someone part of this core tradition. One is they have a general technical agreement on what the physical movements are, even if they vary in details and occasionally throw in a monkey wrench. By and large, they're all describing a Tverhau as a cut that moves across the middle, maybe angled, maybe perfectly horizontal, who knows. They're all describing the Schielhau in a similar way. Maybe the Krumpau works better with the long edge or the short edge or the flat, but it's still this movement, right? So they're giving us a basic technical syllabus of techniques, and they're presenting it in the sequence of the verses in Lichtenauer's poem. So the Zornhau always comes before the Krumpau. The Krumpau never comes before the Zornhau because Lichtenauer said there's 5 strikes, and the first one is the Krumpau, the Zornhau, and the second one is the Krumpau, right?
Mhm.
And so we can look at that. And when we look at Clooney, we have something crazy like 100 or more pictures, not all of which are in the Zettel, because the Zuni has some cool stuff going on, like throwing in extra counters that don't appear anywhere else. But nothing seems to be out of order in the Zettel, and everything that we can look at and say, I know what that technique is, appears in the correct sequence of plays.
Right.
So those two things together make this what we considered like the trunk of the Lichtenauer tradition today. And it's what most people in HEMA, whether they know it or not, who do Lichtenauer longsword, are trying to practice.
That's right. That's right.
And we can throw even more qualifiers on there because most people in HEMA today are not studying anything in particular. They're studying what their teacher tells them to do in class. But where that teaching their teacher is giving them originally came from was probably this sort of group of teachings that are really easy to smush together into a coherent whole.
Mhm.
Does that sound fair?
I think that's
And
a
if they're not doing that, they're doing Meyer, who we'll talk about next time.
yeah, that's right. So this is gonna be a three-part series, and we've already done the first part, which is basically what we just recapped for you today. And then the other sort of space that modern practitioners tend to live in when they're doing their HEMA is the later tradition. And really that mostly just means Joachim Meyer and various teachings around Joachim Meyer. And so, but this time we're going to talk about this sort of middle period of Kunst des Fechtens of Johannes Liechtenauer. So we
Right.
we might
And
think of
so we can say that maybe the early Lichtenauer stuff from last time and Joachim Meyer's stuff for next time are maybe there's probably still a lot more to understand than we currently have, but we've at least, colonized that space quite a bit. And
that's
we were
right.
pretty deep into exploring it. And today we're going to talk about stuff that has not been explored to nearly the same degree, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
for whatever reason, do actually I would offer you a chance to reflect on that a little bit. Do you have any ideas as to why? I have some ideas, but I
I
want to give
think
you
I think there's two pieces, uh, and this will become maybe we should save that question for the end after we go over some examples that we're talking about here, and then we can reflect on why this stuff gets ignored for the most part. How does that sound?
that sounds great. So let's get into
Because
it.
it'll make
So
more sense once I've actually explained stuff and we've talked it through a little bit. And if I try
uh,
to do that now, I'll bring in a bunch of stuff we haven't even talked
makes sense.
about.
So just keep me honest here with regards to what slides we're looking at. So this again, this is what Michael already was describing um, with regards to the sort of order. So like you can clearly see that these techniques that are found in a lot of this is the Clooney, um,
Hmm.
that they're reflective of the types of techniques or and images that we see in other texts that are a
And
part of this gloss
yeah, the one
tradition.
that's not Clooney is Paulus Cal, which is the Zornhau, because Clooney, for whatever reason, doesn't have a picture of the Zornhau.
Right.
Um, it doesn't have literally everything we could ask for, but it has 85% of what we could ask for, which is still more than like this is stuff that was argued about on forums for 15 years, and
Mm.
friends became enemies over questions that once we finally got these scans, maybe they first came online in really poor resolution in 2012. Then that picture of a Krimpau could have solved just so many arguments about what a Krimpau is in 2005, but
Oh
we
my
didn't know
God.
that yet.
Yeah, it's really
And the
funny.
one man who I think did have these scans in 2005, John Clements, was teaching a fucked up Krimpau. Anyway, so he didn't
So
care. The
okay,
rest of us
I
didn't
wasn't
know.
gonna bring it up. I wasn't gonna bring it up, but that video lives rent free in my mind because it was, maybe at one point in HEMA the most viewed video of all HEMA videos on YouTube.
Yeah,
Um,
how a
you
man
know,
who like I suspect he had all these scans because if you dig through his screeds on his website, occasionally you'll find a really low resolution clip of one,
mm,
like in a margin, because he liked to just pepper them with pictures that were irrelevant to what he was talking about.
mhm.
And he had stuff that did not exist on the internet from this book. But anyways, if that's the case, I don't know how he could look at that picture on the lower left there and then come up with the Krimpa that he came up with. But it doesn't
Uh,
matter because John Clements is less relevant to HEMA now than he was back then. Although
mm,
he still has his followers and he's still doing his thing.
yeah.
A
We'll
rising
leave
tide lifts all ships, as it were.
we'll leave it there. Moving on.
But anyway,
So,
so we have these pictures, and this is right, I think, where the conversation about middle HEMA starts, is with
yeah.
Clooney, because we think that this was authored by a guy named Peter Faulkner. We think that because if you'll advance one more slide, the art style in his manuscript that has his name on it is so close that it could have been the same artists working on both manuscripts. And we know that Peter Faulkner, in this manuscript that we have here, it has very short text. It has text that's sometimes Lichtenauer settle and sometimes a very divergent paraphrase of things that are like his settle. But he had a different manuscript that is now lost that we think was destroyed when the Prussians bombed Strasbourg in the 18th century. Um, and their entire archive collapsed and all the books in it were lost, like 100,000 books, including this manuscript was last seen there. But it had a lot of the really wordy early Lichtenauer texts in it. And the only reason we know that is because Christian Trosclair was doing some dictionary spelunking and discovered a dictionary from the 18th century, like 80 years earlier, that was quoting extensively from this manuscript as its sample sentences for fencing terms. So based on that, he extracted like 100 quotes from this manuscript that show that this Peter Faulkner manuscript was one of the classic Lichtenauer anthology texts that just had all the early masters and their writings in it,
Mm,
and could have been similar to what was going to go on the top half of those Clooney pages that don't have any text, which
right.
would have been it the most badass manuscript in Lichtenauer studies, period.
Right.
Instead, what we have is half of the most useful manuscript that exists, but it is still really useful. But so Peter Faulkner was teaching something that is semi-aligned with these early Lichtenauer um, writers, but also throwing in all kinds of extra plays that don't appear anywhere earlier.
Mm,
When you go through Clooney picture by picture, like almost between literally every sort of canonical early Lichtenauer technique, there is one that is not part of that canon. And it's usually an interesting, strange, or inexplicable counter to the one before it. So, and often involves like grappling or grabbing the sword or doing something funky There's lots of hanging parries that show up, which is not really something that shows up in early Liechtenauer, but that gets thrown
Okay.
in as a way to counter a lot of Liechtenauer techniques. Oh, just do this and set their sword aside and then continue on.
Hmm.
And so adding in a whole lot of extra material into the gloss, whatever gloss was going to show up here that we'd never seen before this, or if we have seen it, it was not put into the context of being a counter to one of Lichtenauer's plays. So Peter Faulkner was doing a lot of apparently original work in addition to following Lichtenauer's teachings as they were recorded earlier.
Right.
And that's something we'll see a lot. Now, if you go to the, oh, you're already here. I have the slides up on this screen next to me too, but I'm not keeping up with you very well.
Oh, I see.
Um, Here you can see four pictures that are, the two in the middle are Peter Faulkner. Before that, you have Paulus Cal. And then on the far right, you have Jörg Wilhelm. And you can see sort of this tradition of using these illustrations, but also adding more and more pictures over time. And Jörg Wilhelm in particular, who we'll get to a few slides from now, seems to heavily be borrowing from the Clooney pictures, but adding his own descriptions of what he thought they meant, which is interesting
Hmm.
because they're usually not good matches to the early Lichtenauer teaching.
For sure, and also I find them to be as well. I mean, they're very difficult from an interpretation perspective.
Yeah,
Um,
I feel like he often doesn't give you quite enough description to contextualize it. Christian Trostler disagrees. He thinks Jörg Wilhelm is one of the most important treatises, and he's walked me through some of it, and I see where his ideas come from, but I just can't get there myself. So people,
right.
again, let's come back to that in a few slides.
Okay.
Jörg
Yeah. Yeah.
Wilhelm is worth having a little conversation about
Sounds good. All right.
because after, in
So.
addition to Peter Faulkner, who's writing about the 1490-ish, we have Hans Talhofer, who's writing from about 1450 to 1470 is when his stuff is coming out. So he's later than these earliest Lichtenauer writers, but like the next generation of fencing teacher. And he wrote a whole bunch of fencing treatises. Those top six on that slide there that are bigger are things that either have his name on them or some have argued were written by him. And then the ones below that are just copies and copies because his manuscripts were interesting enough that people kept finding them and hand copying them over and over again, basically every century until the present. Because in the 19th century, they started making photographic reproductions, and now in the 20th century, and now we're making digital reproductions and publishing more books. So, like, Talhofer has been continuously in print, as it were, for like 600 years now. Everybody loved his book, but his book is really not that useful as a fencing source to us because he has hundreds of pictures that are really interesting and detailed, and especially that final one, the Codex Icon 394A, is just beautiful, humanistic, anatomically pretty good artwork with like 100 longsword plays even, but like 3-word descriptions of each thing. So
Right.
trying to construct how we think Hans Talhofer wanted us to fence from 100 pictures and then like 50 words is more or less impossible. So
Right. If you go into
his
it,
stuff has been, sorry, go ahead.
I was just say if you go into his work from the perspective of my goal is to use him as the primary source and the sort of foundational source of my conception of fencing, it would be a real challenge. I find that his
And
stuff is
what
super.
many people did, especially in the early 2000s.
Well, right. Yeah, right. For whatever reason, probably just because his images are so clear and
And one of the earliest German translations that was published and therefore distributed pretty widely was Mark Rector's translation of the 19th century German facsimile
mhm.
um, of that 1467 manuscript. And I have to add that middle step in there because the guy tried to transcribe it. This was Gustav Hartzell in the 1870s, I want to say. but he transcribed it and then also quietly modernized it and quietly added extra words that he thought were missing from the original and were, I don't know, implied. I don't know what his thought process was. So Mark Reicher's translation doesn't line up that great with the original text because he didn't understand the extent to which this German guy had manipulated the text.
Hmm.
But people got that, but it's called Medieval Combat. I've got it on a shelf over here, but I don't. I recently reorganized my shelves. This book
Right.
launched very many German fencing clubs, and it is not a good source to build a fencing method from, but it was what everyone had.
What a piece of HEMA history right there. That's that's like for whoever's interested in writing the historiography of HEMA, you should be aware of all of this stuff.
This book by Gustav Hergsel is what everybody had as far as scans until the Bavarian State Library finally made new digital scans in like
Mm.
2008. So this beastly tome then becomes this book, and this book really was one of the foundational sources for the Liechtenauer movement. Like you
Right.
could question whether Liechtenauer would be as popular today if everybody hadn't started with Talhofer and then finally seen a real Liechtenauer gloss and said, "Oh my God, this is so much better," and then glommed onto that. Like that's sort of the evolution in the
Right.
broadest possible strokes of how Liechtenauer studies went in from like 1998 to 2008. Um,
So a couple of things. So one thing is what I was gonna say was I find it useful. I find the Talhofer stuff useful from with the foundational knowledge that I have from reading the material in the earlier sources or in the sort of gloss tradition. I can then look at the Talhofer material and feel as though what I'm seeing is coherent or makes sense, or I can say like, oh, I can sort of surmise the configurations that this position originated from and how we got here and why we might want to be here. Um, but
totally.
there certainly aren't enough words to sort of parse that out. But
Yeah, and so and this that's a question of granularity too. And this is I'll try not to make it a soapbox rant, but there's different approaches to studying books in HEMA, and one of them is what people on the HEMA Discord call the Jutsu Safari, where if all you're doing is you're going through and being like, all right, here's a funky picture, and then let's figure out how to do this technique. Okay, now we're going to forget about this and go to the next one. And that's a thing that has been popular in workshops and classes the world over. But the another level is how does Talhofer want me to approach fencing, or how does
right,
any author? And I don't think you can get there from Talhofer, even though you can look at it and once you know how to fence, you can be like, all right, his sword looks like it's in a weird place, but I bet if I started off and we bound like this, and then you tried to hook over like that, then I could come in here and you can figure out how to get there.
right.
I don't know
Uh,
that what person can get from those points of information to this is how Talhofer wants me to approach my opponent, and here's his favorite way of initiating, and
yeah.
here's his strategy for like how to respond to the opponent. Like some of those questions are just so much higher order knowledge
Mm,
that you need more, I think, of the author's thoughts to get
mm.
there and have confidence that you understand them. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I really, I when you talk about the Jitsu Safari, I really like that. I talk about that a lot. There's an archetype of a human of early mid '90s martial artist, like a garage martial artist, right? And some of these guys, there's like we have a long history of bullshido, right, being practiced in garages and stuff just being made up. But there's a sort of parallel history of these sort of like punk rock, um, like black belt magazine, like garage martial artists that were it's not bullshido because they really did like kick the shit out of each other, right?
Uh
Like
huh.
they weren't they were like trying to learn stuff and they had
And
access
you know,
to.
that's the lineage that Mike Cartier came from, and we have a lot of those guys in HEMA. Really,
That's
we
exactly
used to,
yeah, for
anyways.
sure. Right. Well, right. That's part of that is that that archetype is sort of less relevant because everyone has so much access to so many different traditions. But there is sort of like, I think of like I went when I was with Jack Gassman, I was teaching some workshops in Ireland, and during the week that I was there, we went and we did some jujitsu, and there's a jiu-jitsu club that Jack was going to in Wexford, and the class that I walked in on was just this guy, right? This archetype, this Kevin Maurer, this Mike Cartier guy who just like he had a beard and he might have been missing a tooth, and he just showed wrist locks, and these are like wrists like he's broken wrists. You know what I mean? Like normally when you see a guy showing standing wrist locks, it's like, Aikido, and it's very gentle, and it's very everything is pliable and relaxed, and like um and these guys just are not built from that cloth. Like and it's
Right, but I
and
mean,
but that's how they developed their art, right? It came from this sort of 80s 90s black belt magazine. Like two or three techniques are buried in the publication, and they're just like teasing them out and then like trying them on each
yeah,
other.
you learn that and you try it on your friends, and then you go out and you fight skinheads and you try it on them, and then over time you might turn into a badass.
Right. Well,
You
that's
figure out what
part of
works
this.
against baseball bats and what doesn't, and you go from there, right?
That's part of the story for me, is that like all of these guys are tough as nails. You could just see the wear and tear that they put themselves through. But and sort of like the legitimacy of their practical experience. Um,
Right, and that's a disconnect I think that some people in modern HEMA have. And now we're getting so far off topic, but I'll try and tie it back to Talhofer, which is, the foundation of fighting. Like, we look at these clubs where these guys were doing Talhofer, or like, I mean, the early Fiore interpretations based on the Pisani Dossi manuscript, which has kind of similar to Lichtenauer. It has one two-line text, a couplet that rhymes, and what it basically says is, Fiore saying, "You tried to attack me, and so I fucked you up," and that's like the entire description. And there's a picture, and then you go through 100 dagger techniques that are just like that. Like, I grabbed your arm, and now I'm going to tear it off, and there's no detailed technical instruction at all. But you have some of these clubs that actually were doing pretty darn good interpretation work, and a lot of that is based on the fact that, this guy who's actually been stabbed in street fights a few times, like, has an idea about what knife fighting looks like. And maybe it's not the only idea about knife fighting. Jay Vale is a guy who is an attorney, and to look at him, you wouldn't guess that he is also a knife fighter, but like, he spends all of his free time like looking at videos of knife attacks and studying how like real world violence works. And his dagger interpretations are based on that as much as on any historical fencing treatise. And
mhm.
he's like, I'll show you 45 security camera clips that all show a guy stabbing the exact same way. So we should probably practice a defense against this specific attack because it comes up
Right.
a lot in these videos. And
Right.
that kind of work is missing from a lot of our dialogue about HEMA today, because we have so much more historical sources, but also so many more training partners who are on the same page as us in a club where we can have 30 or 40 people fence with us.
Yeah.
And those outside inputs are missing a lot of the times, at least to the extent they used to be there. And maybe that means that and that's produced a different mindset. I don't know if it's healthier or not. Maybe it is, but it's
Yeah.
different.
It certainly is. The second thing I wanted to say when we're talking about Talhofer was what so you mentioned him, or you referenced him as part of this Liechtenauer tradition. But that in and of itself is sort of a tenuous connection.
It is. So there are two manuscripts that Talhofer gives us that quote Lichtenauer's poem in them. Okay. And that, if we use that as the criterion by which we say this person is Lichtenauer because he knows the poem, then Talhofer qualifies. One
Mhm.
of those manuscripts he probably purchased, he probably didn't create. We don't know that for sure. But there's no evidence that he personally authored it. It just has
Mhm.
his name on the inside cover, where you would write, like, this book belongs to Hans Talhofer, basically. And the other one quotes an interesting sort of variation on the title that has a lot of extra stuff added in and a lot of words changed, which could be Lichtenauer or Talhofer taking a poem that he never received any teachings on and then making it his own.
Hmm.
So we don't know that he had a strong connection to any other person who we've heard of in the Lichtenauer tradition, but he clearly was moving in the same in Nuremberg, which is sort of the heart of early Lichtenauer. He was a Nuremberg city employee, doing black bag work for Nuremberg, and then later on doing more official, less illegal stuff for Nuremberg. So he had an opportunity to meet these masters, and he knew Lichtenauer's poem, and some of the pictures in his book are very familiar, and you can say, oh, well, that's clearly a Krimpau, even
Hmm.
though all it says is like half of one line of a Krimpau verse as his 3-line caption. You know, I know what this technique is. So there is a connection. He is he is at least adjacent to all the other Lichtenauer stuff and compatible with the other Lichtenauer stuff. But we don't know the extent to which he was taught by any other Lichtenauer masters. All we know is that he had access to Lichtenauer's poem.
Hmm.
So it's hard to place him in the pantheon of Lichtenauer into a specific grouping. He kind of exists as his own concept in my mind.
Yeah.
And certainly the amount of writing he produced and the amount of copies of it mean he also exists as his own entire body of texts,
Mm.
that sort of live by themselves. Is that what you were driving at?
Yeah, right.
And we can certainly use him to unlock Lichtenauer's techniques, but we can't use him without actually knowing what they were in advance. He also, and I remember you wanted to throw this in. So when we start talking about the broader Lichtenauer adjacent tradition, this poem becomes important. And this poem is one of Christian Trosclair's favorite things in the world. It's also one of Martin Fabian's favorite things.
Hmm.
If you, one of the reasons why he loves the Codex Speyer so much, which is what the Fechtbook Fabian has a translation of, is because that picture on the right side of the slide, the one with red text, is this poem that's at the beginning of that manuscript. And it uses a whole lot of key words that appear in Lichtenauer, but
Hmm.
it is a completely different poem that is not quoting Lichtenauer at all.
Right.
And Christian has a whole theory about how this is a Rosetta Stone that ties a whole bunch of different teachings together, Lichtenauer core teachings, and some of the more peripheral excuse me, ones into a harmonious whole.
Mm.
Um, and Talhofer's version is a little bit different from that, but different in interesting ways. Like it replaces. All right, so to give one little sidebar, there's an interesting thing that becomes significant here, which is Lichtenauer teaches 5 cuts, which everyone
Mm.
knows, 5 strikes, 5 Hauen, right? Zorn, Krump, Tver, Schiller, and Scheidler. And then there are 5 other strikes. And Christian Tobler wrote an essay about this called The Other 5 Strikes, where he
Mhm.
mapped some of them. Christian Trosclair has talked about this a lot. And the fact that both of them are named Christian has caused no end of confusion in conversations about
Mhm.
Lichtenauer in the past and will in the future. Christian with a T last name. But these appear in, most notably, Andre Lignitzer, who's another Lichtenauer master, talks about them with sword and buckler. They show up in the dueling shield teachings, in the Gladiatoria manuscript. They show up in Hans Madel, and he frames them as alternative names for the 5 strikes in Lichtenauer.
Mhm.
And they are the Oberhau, the Unterhau, the Wechselhau, the um, oh crap, the Mittelhau, and the Sturzhau.
Mhm.
And you'll find these names in Joachim Meyer. You'll find them all over the place, and not always treated the same way, and not always grouped as 5. But these are more maybe of that ephemeral meta teaching that digs its roots into disparate teaching traditions.
Mhm.
And they show up in this poem, except Talhofer's version replaces some of them with actual Lichtenauer's 5 strike names. So instead of the verse on the Oberhau, it has a verse on the Zornhau. and instead of the verse on the Unterhau, it has a verse on the Krimpau. So
Mhm.
it's interesting that it's a variation on this poem that's only like 75% the same. But it appears in two different 15th century sources, and also uses a lot of terms like roses, for example, that show up elsewhere as the name of bodies of teaching, and here they're just thrown out as a word that's never explained.
Mhm.
So it could be another one of those poems that you memorize and then use to build a framework of techniques around. We don't really know, but it is certainly tantalizing with the number of connections it shows to other sources.
Right. You mentioned Five Strikes, and it reminded me of the Kolner Fecht book, right? Which also makes reference to Five Strikes, but it doesn't sort of explain exactly what it's talking about there.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting ones that, like, the phenomenon that we start seeing with a lot of these peripheral texts. I don't have a slide on that one in this deck, but Kölner, also called Fechtregeln. Kölner just means it's in the city of Cologne at the moment, which is Köln in German, because we in English make up weird names for half the cities in Europe.
Mm.
And the manuscript, especially the longsword part, has like a couple bits and pieces of Lichtenauer's verses,
Yeah.
like maybe 10 lines total out of 109 couplets for the longsword. But
Right.
they're clearly quoting Lichtenauer or quoting somebody who was quoting Lichtenauer, and then a whole bunch of odd teachings that are not quoting Lichtenauer at all, like things about the triangle and the golden cuts and so on that are going off in interesting new directions.
Yeah.
And that has been the subject of tons of research. Like that fascinates Keith Farrell and Jake Norwood and a bunch of other people. How
Yeah.
it is similar to Lichtenauer, but clearly has its own underlying structure to it, and it has enough words that you can tease out some big ideas from it. And it's not just a list of techniques.
Yeah, I think we said that we were going to come back to why some of this stuff is explored and why some of it is less explored. I think Kolner it's just in terms of the nature of the way that we practice HEMA, especially as an interpreter being brought out to teach like these little pocket workshops. Kolner
Mm-hmm.
is like it's like very specifically written for like 21st century HEMAists to do like an hour and a half pocket workshop. Like,
Yeah, you can, and that's quite popular. I know that I've seen over the years many workshops based on Kellner along those lines. But like Jake Norwood designed the entire beginner curriculum for CKDF just out of that one book, or like 80% of it was just that book. So
right,
like you can turn it into real teachings, but that's not always what gets you invited to events. So you can
right.
also turn it into check out this wacky stuff you haven't tried before, and that is sometimes what gets you free plane tickets.
Right. So yeah. So anyway, we were talking about Kolner and its relationship to this whole thing, and that sort of this trajectory kind of defines this period in history. It's just sort of like there are so many different offshoots, and the way that you describe the early stuff as being the trunk, it's sort of like I I feel I feel like that's a really good metaphor for sort of thinking about these new trajectories as branches off of the trunk, so to speak.
Right, and to be really fair to these sources, I mean, there's an extent to which the title is the trunk, and the glosses even are just some of the bigger branches that come off, even though we treat them as indistinguishable from the title. And
Right.
I know for me, most of what I think about what the title means is based on the glosses. It's hard to come at it and disagree with the glosses in a sensible way when it comes to the title, because what are you basing that on? And I have
Right.
places where I can say, after many years of thinking about it, I think this one verse, they're more misunderstanding, and I think there's a lesson here. But I don't think any of us will ever get to the point where we can just say, nah, all these guys are totally wrong. I will tell you what this entire poem
Well,
means.
so it's funny.
How would you do that?
That was a thing that Jack Gassman did for like a year and a half in like 2019, I think. He was he went he just went on this sort of like, no, it's all in the Zettel. All of the glasses are just made up. And
Yeah, I can teach you. I can tell you all of Liechtenauer purely referencing the Zettel. I'm not quoting anything else. But the only way you get there is by studying the shit out of the glosses and then doing all the linguistic research, and then you can finally get to the point where you can say, "Oh, wait. There's one word in this line that they're completely ignoring, and if you add this word in, their teachings are not valid anymore. So maybe they didn't. Maybe the reason why the sphere to the oxen plow is described in the glosses as sphere to the four openings, and the openings are just sometimes given cute little nicknames of oxen plow. Maybe that's actually because they had no idea what sphere to the oxen plow meant,
Mm,
and there's nobody ever referred to the four openings as oxen plow." Right? Or you can say, well, the fear Fizetzen, it says there are four cuts, or there are four ways to parry, and they also trouble the four guards. So if all we're teaching is how to use four cuts against four guards, why aren't we talking about four ways to parry? What does also mean in that sentence?
mhm.
If the four ways to parry means attacking the four guards, why does it say also? And like those weeds are fun, and I love to explore those weeds. But if you don't have the glosses to begin with, you can't get there. And Jack
Right.
has read everything there is to read when it comes to Liechtenauer. So he is not
Right.
just some jackhole who's like, I'm just going to look at the poem. I don't need books. Like,
Right.
Jack is a serious scholar. And people who can take that knowledge and then go back to the gloss with fresh eyes and say, all right, how does the gloss relate to these teachings? Does the gloss actually fit the poem or not? You have to do a whole lot of work to get there, and then you can have fun there forever. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
I promise you that Jack was partially trolling and
Uh-huh.
partially, doing exactly like with full knowledge that that's what he was doing. Um, but
Right.
it
And there was a
was
time when I thought that setting the Zettel directly was impossible. Like, I will own that I probably like had strenuous arguments on forums for years saying, no, that is a stupid approach. Don't do that. You're just going to come to wrong conclusions. And I was wrong. Like, you can totally do that, but you got to do your homework first.
right.
Otherwise, you're just the guy who literally the book says this poem was written so that some schlub cannot understand it. You will be that schlub unless you've actually done the studying first, and then you can go back and write your own gloss if you're so inclined.
Let's move on with our slide here. Okay, great. So this is cool, and this will be the end of our discussion today.
Yeah. Okay.
So who are these knuckleheads?
So I said earlier that the early Liechtenauer tradition seems to be based in the city of Nuremberg, or at least all of the guys who we have found historically in records were based in or near Nuremberg. And that means Paulus Cal, that means Hans Talhofer. Um, Hartmann von Nuremberg is one of the members of the Society of Liechtenauer. Right? You have Hans Pegnitzer in the Society of Liechtenauer, and Pegnitz is a river that runs through Nuremberg. Man, my throat is just really. And then Hans Lecukner, the priest, was based in Nuremberg for a long time. Hans Stettner, Society of Liechtenauer, based or operating in and around Nuremberg. There's a whole lot of connections to that region. Nuremberg, one of their outer defensive forts, is called Lichtenau,
Mm,
and is maybe the best candidate for being the place where Hans Lichtenauer came from. And in fact, a dude named Yoli, who I think recently changed his last name, and I can't remember the new one, has a theory that he even has found a candidate in the Nuremberg leadership for being Hans Lichtenauer,
mhm.
who is maybe not quite the right time period, but if we're off a little bit in what time we think Lichtenauer lived, totally a viable candidate. So all that stuff is happening in Nuremberg, but like, I don't know, 80 miles, 100 miles south of Nuremberg.
Mhm.
I could be wildly off on that number. South of Nuremberg, we have the city of Augsburg, which appears to have a completely separate but fairly coherent recorded fencing tradition. And there we have a number of the manuscripts that are associated with that. The most well known one Yeah, I think that's true. Even though a lot of these are actually fairly well known. The most famous one is going to be the next slide, which we call Codex Wallerstein or Bauman Fechtbook, which is that picture on the side there in that slide, and also the top row in this slide. And this tradition, if you can see, I don't know why I made these pictures so small. That's not how I did most of these slides. But you can see there's longsword, there's messer, there's dagger, and there's wrestling. And I'm sure you've seen those pictures. If nothing else, you, regardless of who you are watching this video, have certainly seen the famous picture of the double leg takedown, um, which has become one of the memes that won't die in HEMA, all from Codex Wallerstein. It's more properly called the Bauman Fecht book, because the earliest owner that we know of for the book was named Bauman. It's called Codex Wallerstein because it was one of about 12 fencing manuals that were stored at Wallerstein Castle in the 19th century, and somehow the only one that anyone. Well, anyway, there's a whole chain of things that led to the name. That's not important.
Okay.
But there are a lot of Wallerstein manuscripts, and this was one of them. This was then copied by the famous Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, who copied the entire wrestling and some of the other pictures. And that's the two on the lower left there are his art, and that's actually a fairly famous manuscript as well, because Dürer is famous, and so everything he did is kind of famous. He again was back in Nuremberg. Augsburg and Nuremberg are not that far apart geographically, and there was clearly fencing sharing happening between the two cities.
Hmm.
But Augsburg becomes this center of book production and of fencing manual production. Another Augsburg fencing master was named Antonius Rast, and he was then part of the Marx Bruder collective. And the lower right ones are what his manuscript looks like. He was also mostly copying Codex Wallerstein slash Bauman Fecht book, except he kind of edited the descriptions and he changed words and tweaked the descriptions, added little bits. So his version reads similarly, but clearly has been corrected
Hmm.
or modified in some way to fit his ideas. And he also covers the same things: longsword, dagger, wrestling, and messer, with some extra stuff that's not drawn from Codex Wallerstein. So he might have actually had a different source that was like the source that both of them come from. We don't really know. The manuscript that we have was actually created by Paulus Hector Meyer,
Hmm.
copied out of a manuscript that he bought from Antonius Rast's estate sale. So there's this a whole network of like historical happenings there.
Yeah. So I
But we
think
see this coherent like body of techniques and teachings that passes through many different hands over the course of a century, all sort of focus in and around this city. And it culminates with Paulus Hector Meyer, who we'll get to in a minute.
right. So I think it's interesting. One of the ways, well, okay, so it's categorically different from the sort of what we've regarded as the trunk of the Liechtenauer teachings. It's
Hmm.
not in certain cases they're using some of the terminology or the lines of the Zettel. One of the major distinctions that I think is interesting when we're talking about sort of the difference between Cyber and Kolner and Talhofer versus um, this sort of Augsburg tradition is like the five words fencers versus five strikes fencers. Um,
Mm.
so like the um, or I maybe not even five strikes fencers, but like the parts of the tradition or the parts of the layout of the tradition that people are interested in. So like the Augsburg group are looking at they're formatting a lot of their stuff based on the five words. Wilhelm makes reference to the five words. Durer and or Rast makes reference to the five words, whereas that doesn't really come up in Cyber or Kolner, um, or Talhofer for that matter. Talhofer is harder because he doesn't have a lot of words, so you don't know what he's
Yeah,
But
sure,
you know,
sure.
so I just for me personally, because that's been a huge part of my practice as a hemaist and as a fencer, is sort of the difference between those types of things. And
Yeah, so the 5 words show up in Bauman and thus in the other manuscripts you mentioned. Also, a few other keywords from Lichtenauer, like one of the very first plays, the one pictured there actually with the longsword, also invokes a verse from Lichtenauer's Zettel, sort of kind of invokes it because it's the verse that that says that in the end you should know that all arts have length and measure, or that
yes, that's right. Yeah.
lenga und Masse, which both actually could mean measure, can mean measure in moderation. They're kind of words that refer to temperance,
Hmm.
as like you shouldn't be too extreme in your fencing. And in this play, in the paragraph, it says, now when you do this, you attack your opponent, and then you come to a bind. Remember length and measure, and this
Yeah.
is what length means. And this is what measure means. So it kind of spells that out as almost a gloss of that verse that isn't glossed anywhere else, except also sort of indirectly in 3227a. So yeah, it certainly reads like someone who at least is sharing in the ideas that inform Lichtenauer.
Right.
And whether that's because they are part of Lichtenauer's tradition or Lichtenauer is part of a broader tradition is a question that we can't answer at the moment. But
Hmm.
they certainly have these ideas in common, even though a lot of what they're doing in the fencing actions, the techniques, are not things Lichtenauer explicitly describes.
Hmm.
So you can certainly bring this into Lichtenauer practice, and you're not going to find, it'll find a place there. It's not like this is a completely alien thing where you have to choose column A or column B, but it's a thing where we can't understand the historical connection very well, even though there's obviously conceptual links,
Hmm.
is how I would
Right.
describe it.
Right. I mean, like the fact that they put the words in the order that they put
Yeah.
them in makes it clear that they're
And
like,
in the first 5 plays, right, there's a little word written above the paragraph that is the what 3227A calls the 5 words, right? Before, after, strong, weak, and within or indes, if you're nasty. And the those words aren't used a lot. But what's also interesting is that we get out of Bauman, Wallerstein, and into the other manuscripts, and they are also have some of the Lichtenauer text treatises included in them alongside these teachings. So
mhm,
certainly to those later people, these were not incompatible. These were worth discussing at the same time and in the same books. So to the extent that we can say these books were intentionally created with certain contents,
yeah.
someone chose these contents to go in the same book.
Yeah, I really I hadn't actually made it a point to conceive of length and measure. Like obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I have known that they're sort of to be thought of it more as balance rather than sort of like the way that you might the way that if you're a modern fencer, you hear length and measure, you might think, "Oh, yeah, everything is timing and distance," right? Like, because that's modern fencing theory is all just everything is timing and distance, which is
Mhm.
true. That is true because we live in space time, but but
Right.
but sort of
Yeah,
length and
Aristotle
measure
approves. Yeah.
length and measure in terms of balance and sensitivity, right? That's like we only give as much as we're the corresponding pressure demands, right, and we're
Yeah, and
responding.
there's 2 different glosses of this. So I guess to dwell on that for a moment, the translation of it varies. Like everybody has their own way of rendering it. It could be really simple. You could just say time and place, and that's not wrong, right? Or I guess place and time could be length and measure. You could say measure and moderation, which is where I usually end up, because both lenga and masa can mean measure, but different kinds of measure. You could even say measure and measure to be really confusing. But you can also say weight and measure. There's a level in which it's just saying everything is sort of has qualities and blah blah blah. 3227A takes it in sort of a figurative way. Well, not really figurative. I don't know what the word is, but it says that it's because everything in Liechtenauer is a balance between two extremes,
Mhm.
right? And so it's all hard and soft. It's before and after. It's pushing and pulling, right? It's going high and going low. Everything is sort of being described in the context of two opposing ideas, and then you have to find the balance point in between them. And that's how it invokes that line in its discussion of the five words. And it says, this is what Lichtenauer means by all arts have Lenga und Masse,
Mhm.
is it means it's all about putting these two opposites together in contrast and fencing in the space between them. Whereas in Bauman, it has a more physical interpretation, and it says when you get into your position, now here's what it means in action. So you're bound with your opponent, and Lenga now means it has a phrase I like, which is that you bring yourself, you extend your sword, and you make yourself large in the sword, or small in the body and large in the sword. And then
Mm.
masa means having proper balance in this position. All right, so it talks about vaga. Um, am I am I mangling that quote? Oh, now I have to pull back the hour up. I just said I liked it, and then I'm not sure I'm actually quoting it correctly. Um, but anyways, so it's now saying, well, what it means is physically, when you're in a bind, these are attributes you need to manifest, and not
Right.
just an idea of how you understand the teaching.
Right. Well, and there's a
So
sense in which, so like, and I'm gonna always lump frequency modus into this because it's just
right.
another perspective of the same idea, which is this constant sort of finding the balance. Um, and the thing about frequency modus is that you can think about it as it applies to the physical bind when the swords are connected and you're perceiving pressure signals that way, or you could think of it
Hmm.
outside of the bind, or you could think of it in terms of understanding intention, right? There's like this meta bind of like, I know that he wants to attack in the vor, right? Like we're way out in the Sufechten, and I can perceive through the subtle cues that I'm getting from his psychology what the nature of his quality of action is going to be. Um, and so like always being sensitive to that. So you could say frequency modus isn't just I'm moving materially in space according to strong and weak, but I'm also moving in terms of intention. Like I'm able to perceive, oh, he was looking to attack me, but something spooked him, and so now is my opportunity to attack into him. Like those types of things. You could
Hmm.
say, you could say that there's like this meta version of all of these principles. So when you talk about length and measure in the context of this sort of dichotomy, um, versus like, oh, by the way, you need to have length and measure just in terms of the way that you're standing, right? Like it's the same principle applied to all things. You can't be strong if you don't have a structural comportment that lends itself to strength.
Hmm.
So that's sort of like I think that's really
Yeah.
cool.
And so, but yeah, so and this is sort of I mean, even this is an example of how Lichtenauer's teachings often don't just mean one thing. And when you start really digging into the weeds of the Zettel, you realize that someone had to workshop the shit out of this poem over a very long period of time. This is not somebody who sat down one day and just wrote a poem, because the idea is just sort of almost always, maybe not every single line, but there's a whole lot of them where they're very carefully created to pack more meaning into 8 words than you would have ever thought possible. And I know that back in the old days, that was just part of education. You learned how to do those kinds of things in a way that we don't teach anymore. But it's really impressive. Like even just this one, which sounds like it's just a proverb, all things have these two virtues. And then wait, no, but it also means that it speaks to how the art is structured, in the mind of this one guy, and another person, it speaks to how you behave in the bind and how you can keep yourself safe. And I found the quote here. It says you need to make yourself small in the body so you are great in the sword.
Mm,
And that's by having a balanced position and staying behind your sword as you get into that initial bind.
mm,
Um, and this is even a throwaway line that it isn't described in a lot of Lichtenauer sources, but the ones that do present multiple useful lessons out of this one line.
Mhm.
But and that's sort of the essence of why this poem exists. Really, is because it's not just there to encode the thing that Lichtenauer is teaching you, but it's there to give you tools about how to think about fencing.
Mhm.
And I think that's the most useful attribute of it, more than just being a structure that you can hang techniques on, but it's sort of mental frameworks about how a fight works, beyond any physical movement, and then
Right.
reaching to the physical space once you have the framework.
Right. And and I've made the point several times, and I think I made the point the last time we attempted this volume two of our three-part series. That for me, the teachings of Liechtenauer are like the guiding principle of my life. Like really, like in the same way that like a lot of Taoists sort of uh or like sort of Taoism is encoded in Musashi, right? So like um if you study Musashi, you get all these principles about swordsmanship, but then also you get all of these principles about life, right? And
Hmm.
sort of Taoism is embedded within that, but then you can take that framework and approach all of your movement through space time, right? Like or
Hmm.
action through space time, using this framework as a lens to inform your your behavior and
Yeah.
choices.
Do you apply this to musical theory? Is there a
Absolutely.
Lichtenauer school of music?
So listen, that's a joke, except that my
It's
like
not actually a joke. I'm
my
curious.
I have like 8-year-old whistle students who get dressed up in these Irish dancing gowns and have big wigs, and they know what fuel and indes is, right? Like in a very
Sure.
meaningful way, like in a very meaning, like it's a fundamental part of what it means to play music. Because like when you're playing music with somebody, you have to first of all, you can't be a buffalo, right? Like you have to be paying attention to the rhythm, and not just the rhythm that you're hearing with the other musicians, and trying to embody those qualities in your own practice, in your own playing when you're playing with them, but also there's a sort of look at this, there's a sort of meta fuel in of like how I don't know how competent my training partner is, or in this case, my fellow musician is, to be able to play in this rhythmic quality that I want to express. And so I need to have balance in that. I'm going to meet them halfway, right? Like I'm going to find
Hmm.
where we can both sort of share the space, and that's going to be the music that we make. And it's for that reason that every instance of us playing together is a different. It creates a different art, right? Or a different work of art, so to speak. So like, yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
that
no,
wasn't a joke. I was curious, but
yeah, a hundred percent,
I suspected it was true.
100% true. That's music.
I mean,
It's
it's also true in ballroom dance, which I used to do, when I was in college and kind of gotten out of the habit. But like, it's all about Fulin and it's all about some of those things. And you could totally, I don't know if it'd be valuable to most people, but you could totally describe a whole lot of what happens in dance in terms of the 5 words. Um, and it would make sense exactly to like people who've studied Lichtenauer and nobody else, but
right,
it's totally there.
right. Okay, so let's keep moving
Yeah,
here because we're almost.
we're going long on this, so let's bust through a few more slides and we can come to the wrap up.
We're well. So let's
We
do this. Let's talk about Mayor Meyer. Let's talk about him in the part three. Let's talk
Okay.
about Parnfight and Eganolf, and sort of tie them into what's going on here, and then set the table for part three.
Yeah, so Andre Parnfeint is really interesting. He published a book in 1516, which is the first published Lichtenauer text, and also the first published illustrated, excuse me, fencing manual. And by published, I mean printed. And it here's an example of, actually. Did you skip a slide?
I did. Which one would you like me to?
I don't remember how many slides. Let's go back to the first one. Yeah, so that's the title page of his book. It has sword. And then next slide, it also has Dusak and staff, and those are the sections. And then it also quotes Andre Lignitzer's dagger and sword and buckler teachings, which are extremely short. There's 8 dagger plays and 6 sword and buckler plays from Lignitzer, and he has that at the back. And that's maybe the only evidence we have that he was aware of earlier Liechtenauer writings, because by and large his stuff is unique. It's or at least it's original, and then it is not structured like any earlier text. He quotes Liechtenauer Zettel, but he
Mhm.
kind of takes the sections out of order, and there's
Mhm.
no rhyme or reason obvious to how he places them in the book, because he'll like have a section on he'll have the entire Krimpau verse, and then I think immediately after that is the teachings on the guard iron door maybe, and so like it's not anything like the earlier Lichtenauer texts, and it almost seems like he's quoting the Zettel as like a symbolic thing, like this is what you do, you quote the Zettel, but
Mhm.
he's not using it to structure his teachings, at least as far as I can see. Maybe Adam Franti has looked at it more, and I know he's looked at it more. Maybe he's come to see that there is some harmony there between the Zettel verses and the techniques he teaches, but I have not found any such pattern. But he does quote the entire Zettel, so he is familiar with Lichtenauer's core teaching, and then he does his own thing with it, and he has all of these interesting teachings, some of which have echoes in other sources, many of which would influence writers after him.
Mhm.
Um, but it's entirely possible that he had never seen a Lichtenauer longsword text. In fact, it's possible he had never seen any fencing text except Andre Lignitzer, and he was basically trying to invent the genre of fencing manual by himself. He also describes himself as a Freifechter. He's the first fencing author we have who does that. Freifechter was the middle rank in the Marxbrüder organization. You had to get tested as a Freifechter before you could try to get tested as a master.
Mhm.
And many people got their Freifechter and then never tried to become masters, because a Freifechter you could get locally from a master, and to become a master you had to go to Frankfurt and like do the whole formal thing. So a lot of guys seem to have just become Freifechter and been content, maybe including him. And he worked as a professional bodyguard for a well-known cardinal, and probably for other people. His book was translated to French in 1538 and published in, I want to say, Antwerp. And it was also, so if you go to the next slide,
Oh, yeah.
um, there's a hand copied version by Reinhard Zollinger, who's one of the more important fencing masters of the 16th century, in terms of disseminating books. Like he seemed to have been some kind of book dealer in addition to being a fencer, because he was Paulus Hector Meyer's supplier, and he also has his name in some other fencing manuscripts that Meyer didn't own. So he was buying and selling fencing manuscripts, and in this case, he had a hand copy made of Parnfeint's book, and that's that one at the bottom. And it was also copied into the Goliath Fecht book, only the staff section and not
Mhm.
the pictures, which is cool, which is another manuscript. And then next slide, Christian Egenolf in the 1530s decided he was going to publish a fencing book, and he grabbed most of Parnfeint's book, but he had new illustrations made by Hans Weiditz, who was a much better artist than whoever it is did Parnfeint. Parnfeint stuff is actually kind of cool. Go back one more. The other cool thing is that he had an innovative approach to the illustrations, which is he had individual dudes cut out, and then he would line up 2 of them side by side to make each picture,
Hmm.
or except for the ones where they overlap, like that staff one. But like these 2 Dusak guys are actually on separate printing blocks, and then they would just put a border around them of
Mm.
more little sticks, so that he could have fewer actual individual printing plates made and save money, and then create more illustrations. But as a result, the illustrations are often not very useful for understanding the book, because they're sort of stock positions that are just
Right.
juxtaposed together. So Egenal took those, and he had really high quality art made by a much better engraver named Hans Weiditz. This was in the era before the idea of copyright existed, so you didn't need to worry about getting permission. The general idea was that once something is written, it belongs to whoever owns a copy of it. So once you buy the book, you have the rights to whatever happens to this book. In this case, making copies of it. And he did. He made a an even more extensive book, which not only has Parnfine stuff, but also has some extra dagger and wrestling plays of unknown origin. And this was printed 4 times, 3 times when he was alive, and then once after he died by his heirs, and seems to have gotten pretty wide distribution. You can see the influence of this book in a couple of different later sources.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know, is there anything else you want to say about Parnfine?
No, I mean, I guess really where these players are gonna come into focus is really when we start talking about Meyer,
Mm-hmm.
um, right? Because Meyer is going to be huge, like he is going to be hugely influenced by this movement, right? Like
Yep.
just the idea of printed manual is going to, is going to make a lot of um, it's going to direct him in a lot of ways. But then also the material is certainly he Meyer uses it to inform. And then Christian Treskler has all these ideas about what Meyer thought. Like if Meyer specifically has opinions about these particular fencers. Like so, who are the Zettel fencers, right? That Meyer is talking about, and
Right,
it's
and Egenolf was based in Frankfurt am Main, which was the headquarters of the Marxbruder Fencing Guild.
mhm,
So that's where he had his workshop. And it's possible that when Meyer talks about the Frankfurt Zettel and the Frankfurt fencers, he's referring not only to the Marxbruder but also to Egenolf and that tradition. But we can come back to that idea when we talk about Meyer. Let's go back to Wilhelm really quick before we wrap up, which is I think 3 slides up before Paul's Hector. Because we kind of started to talk about him, but just to flesh that out more,
mhm.
um, here's a pretzel salesman. We don't know what that guy's doing there in the picture,
Uh,
but his book is known for 2 things. One of them is wacky art, and the most well-known manuscript of his work, which is the one that Dirk Hagedorn did an edition of. A lot of people are wearing carnival costumes for no discernible reason.
mhm,
His artwork is clearly based on earlier illustrated sources. The Cluny is the main source for his longsword, and then the Ortenberg Fecht book, which is lost, but which Dirk managed to find a microfilm scan of and publish, is the basis for his armored and mounted stuff. But he kind of adds text to it, and a lot of his longsword text is sort of paraphrases of Liechtenauer's Zettel with
mhm.
like 1 or 2 lines of extra description in
Right,
addition to that. So like, and he won't even usually acknowledge that he's quoting the Zettel. It'll be a weird thing where there'll be like a half a sentence and then a whole bunch of Zettel just like in the middle of the paragraph and then a
right,
few more sentences. So you can get enough to know that he's clearly teaching something that's Lichtenauer related, but often he doesn't give you enough to appreciate why the picture is showing something that doesn't sound at all like what we expect that verse to mean.
right.
So you have to put a lot of work in to arrive at a useful fencing system. And I know that Christian has done the work, and this is Christian Trosclair again, has taught classes on Wilhelm, and he believes that Wilhelm is right there in the middle of the Lichtenauer tradition and is teaching stuff, is showing stuff that was a very common teaching and feeds back into all the other sources.
Mhm,
I can't get there again, and this is me not having put in that work. So I have no idea what a lot of it is teaching. But he influences various later writers, Gregor Ehrhardt, Paulus Hector Meyer. He also includes in his manuscript a version of the RDL gloss that we call Nikolaus, but only the longsword.
mhm,
So he's again aware of what the teaching that we think of as being the most correct is, and then clearly choosing not to do that in his illustrated part and doing something else.
mhm.
And here's a list of all the manuscripts that have his stuff in it. There's quite a few. His stuff was recopied many times. And I guess the only other thing to say about him is that we don't actually know if he was the author. His name is in all the books that have this style of illustration, but he could have just been a compiler,
Mm.
and he was the client and not the writer, and somebody else actually did the authorship. We don't know. But Wilhelm is the name associated with this teaching, anyways. And Hutter just means that his trade was hatter,
So
but
that
his
came
name
up
was
in
Jörg Wilhelm.
my Discord, my Patreon Discord, like a week ago. Somebody was talking about Wilhelm, and he's Hutter in my headcanon because that's what he has been for me. And so I was like making my comment, blah blah blah, Hutter, and I was like, I know that we don't say that anymore, but I'm still gonna say it. And then someone had to ask, like, wait, why don't we why don't we say Hutter anymore?
Yeah,
Um,
Dirk Hagedorn pointed out that it's not actually given as his name, part of his name. It's just in there in his signature because it's basically says Georg Wilhelm Hatter from Strasbourg,
mhm,
Hatter from Augsburg.
mhm,
Um, and then I guess there is one more thing to say about him, which is some of his illustrations have a certain resemblance to what's in Bauman slash Wallerstein.
right,
So it seems like whatever he's recording here has a certain um, connection to the other teachings that also come from the city of Augsburg. And even though he's giving a different like collection of things, it seems like it is somehow tied in with the other stuff in the Wallerstein Bauman part of the tradition, to where
right.
we could talk about maybe they are all partaking in this same fencing community in the city of Augsburg.
Sure. So that being said, we said that we were trying to set the table here for our last hurrah into this journey. So that's going to be the Myers, Paulus
Yep.
Hector, who's going to extend this tradition along with a bunch of
And
other
really all the
crazy,
other ones too.
yeah. And then
Yeah, so Paulus
go ahead.
Hector is sort of the end of this tradition of Lichtenauer teaching. Like he's the capstone of
Mhm.
all of it, and we'll talk about what that means next time. And
Yep.
then Joachim Meyer comes along. He was about a generation later, but alive at the same time. And in fact, his entire lifetime was inside of Paulus Hector's because Paulus Hector outlived him.
Yeah.
And Joachim Meyer died at the age of 33. And he is no longer really trying to carry on this tradition. He's clearly trying to create something new that encapsulates everything that's been taught and that encapsulates the tradition, but is presented in a radical new format. And
Right.
so he sort of
And then is
stands outside
also
of all this.
and it also very directly, like, he's very directly engaging with things outside of the tradition in a way that
Yes.
maybe not everybody else has been thus far.
So yeah, Paulus Hector is trying to catalog all this stuff we've talked about, and Joachim Meyer is trying to synthesize it into something that is his own creation.
Yeah.
All of
All
this
right.
stuff and more.
Well, that'll
And
be
so
next
that'll be
time.
next time.
All right. Thanks,
Do,
Mike.
do
That
you
was
want to
great.
do a quick wrap up about any of this, or are we just going to cut it off?
I think I think bye everybody.